Welcome to another episode of SummitCast. In today's show, we're going to be looking at what are the problems with Marxism. Welcome to the show today. We have a guest with us from England, Ed, who's got a bit of a background in studying Marxism. And we're going to be looking at the background of Marxism and what it really is. One thing I'm noticing is that a lot of the kind of ideas of Marxism have somewhat like permeated society and just the way a lot of people look at the world. So Ed, could you maybe just start off with tell us a bit about your background of studying Marxism and then get into, how we got here?
Okay, so thanks, Peter, and thanks for having me on the show. Well, my background really is, for my degree, I read philosophy and intellectual history, and there was a significant component of that was political philosophy, and in particular Marxism as a philosophy. I was also about 10 years ago now, also did some postgraduate study at the University of Birmingham. My first degree was University of Huddersfield in England, and then University of Birmingham about 10 years ago, where I read postgraduate level, read political science. And there was, again, a significant emphasis on Marxist analysis of politics, economy, and society throughout that. So basically, I got a lot of Marxist thought and Marxist theory and a lot of study of Marxism in relation to all sorts of different areas. So that's my background, really.
So just for the people who may not have had the background, could you give us just like a brief introduction to Marxism, where it came from and what it believes and so on?
Okay, so I'll try and be as brief as I reasonably can. So Karl Marx is a 19th century German philosopher from Trier in Germany, who ultimately ends up in England, in London, living in London, where he develops his theory, which we come to call Marxism. And Marxism really is a theory about how and why societies develop and change over time. So in effect, what Marx is saying is, if you think about the fundamental activities of humans, the primary thing that we're engaged in is meeting our own needs, food, clothing, housing, all of the goods and all of the things that we need to survive day in, day out. And when human beings are producing these things, when they're engaged in the process of production, you fundamentally got, in Marx's view, two different sets of people, or two classes. One is going to be the class of people who own the whatever it is, the tools, the factories, the machines, the wherewithal to make stuff. Also, they're going to be the people that own the financial capital to invest in those things and purchase them. So those would be the owners of the means of production. And the next group of people are going to be the people who don't own those things, who are going to be obliged to work for those who are the owners of the means of production. So in effect, what he's saying really is that the act of production throws up two separate and distinct classes based on their role in economic activity. So one, which is the first example I gave, those who own the means of production, he referred to them as the bourgeoisie, and they become in effect the ruling class within that society. The other group, certainly in capitalist industrial society, he referred to as the proletariat, loosely the working class, if you will. And these are the people that are obliged to work for those, the owners, the factory owners, the owners of capital, and so on and so forth. Now, what Marx is saying is that over the course of human history, the act of production has always thrown up two separate but antagonistic classes of people. They've got two separate sets of interests. Over time, these classes will come into conflict, and the result of that conflict will be a third new next stage of society. So you would start with the sort of a period of cavemen, I guess. Then we have the era, if you think about the sort of ancient empires of the era of slavery. So you'd have the slave owner, who becomes the ruling class, and you have the slaves themselves. So that's a sort of a simple example of the two classes involved in economic production. They come into conflict. That conflict resolves into the next stage of society, which is the feudal stage. So you have the landowners. Again, they're the ruling class. They own the wherewithal to make the stuff, grow the produce. And you have the peasants or tenant farmers who are obliged to work for them. Again, they come into conflict, and that resolves itself into the next stage of society, which is capitalism, the capitalist stage, or industrial capitalism. And you've got the owners of the means of production, the factories, the machines, the capital, the financial capital. They're the ruling class now, or certainly when Marx was writing. So they're the ruling class, the bourgeoisie. And you've got the workers, who are the oppressed class, as he saw it, and they're the proletariat. Now, what Marx thought was that he wasn't just suggesting some sort of marvelous utopia. Wouldn't it be great if society was socialist or communist? What he was actually saying was that he felt he'd discovered a scientific law that underpinned and would accurately predict, therefore, the progress or the future of society going forward from where they were in at the time that he was writing, sort of mid to late 19th century. So Marx said, well, we've got this capitalist phase right now of society, and society is going to, the two classes are going to come into conflict, and this will result in the proletariat violently overthrowing the ruling class. There's a lengthy kind of explanation and sort of theoretical series of reasons as to why that will happen. But fundamentally that will happen, he said. It's inevitable, it can't be stopped, it's a scientific law, it's a process that society is going through. And the proletariat will then form a dictatorship of the proletariat, and they will form a new economic system, which will be socialism. And socialism will be a system whereby all things, all property and wealth is owned in common, but by the state, on behalf, if you like, of society. So you would then have the phenomenon of the planned economy, the command economy, in effect governed by the workers, the proletariat. Over time, that socialist state of society would give way to the next and final stage, which would be communism. And what he said was that a socialist society will work kind of like a machine, really, rather than having a competitive capitalist market-based way of distributing things, making things, the whole economic effort. This planned economic and social system would involve everybody cooperating together, basically. Everyone would fit together, cooperate together, and then over time, gradually, people would sort of go, well, actually, we don't really need the state to tell us what to do. We don't need the state to plan everything. We will just cooperate anyway. So there would be what he called the withering away of the state. So from capitalism to socialism, state-centered, state-run planned economy, and then gradually to the withering away of the state, and people would just have learned through the planned cooperative economic effort. They would learn to just work together, get on together, share things together, and that would be the final stage of society. At which point history would stop, and that's it. It wouldn't go any further than that. So it's an idea that it's an idea of society and economy and politics, how things change and develop over time, this basic idea of two classes, conflict, a third next stage. This is, if you want to know, a process called dialectical materialism. And it's also what in academic circles would be called a teleological theory. In other words, that means that history is going somewhere. It has an end point and an end destination, and that's communism. And you can't stop that. It'll just come about because that's the underlying scientific law that describes social and economic change, and that's where it's going to end up. And he believed that he discovered that law. So there's a distinction. He made a distinction between utopian socialism, dreaming up a great future fantastic society, and what he called scientific socialism. So, you know, 19th century, this is the era of science. This is the era of sort of, you know, Newtonian laws of motion and the discovery of all that kind of thing. It's the rise of the scientific age, and he wanted to be, I guess, part of that. And so he said, my socialism, my idea is a scientific idea, and, you know, forget everything else. You know, whether you want it or not, whether you desire it or not, doesn't matter. It's going to happen anyway. So that, in very simple, oversimplified terms, is Marxist theory. Yeah.
So that's the theory that was behind the Russian Revolution, I guess. So did they, to what extent did they actually kind of follow the theory and what it said they should do?
Well, what you have to understand is that the Russian Revolution perhaps didn't really quite take place in the way that Marx said it would. For one thing, Russia at that time was not the most advanced capitalist industrial economy or society. It was still very much in a kind of feudal or late feudal kind of stage. It wasn't really at the advanced industrial capitalist societies of, say, Britain, America, some other Western European countries.
And that's where, according to Marx's theory, the revolution should have happened in the most advanced countries, right?
Yeah. So the country that goes capitalist first must evidently be the country that goes socialist first. So the first socialist countries should have been Britain and America, which is a problem that we'll come back to later on. Marx's ideas are added to and sort of adapted somewhat by Vladimir Lenin, who of course was the leader and father of the Bolshevik or communist revolution in Russia, which then of course broadens out a bit and becomes the Soviet Union. So Lenin adds certain things to the theory. One of them is that, look, we can't just hang around and wait for the industrial working class, the proletariat, to develop this revolutionary spirit and overthrow the ruling class. Okay, we can't just wait for things to pan out. We've got to make this happen. So he talks about the Bolshevik party, the communist parties that become, what he says is that you need a small, disciplined, tight kind of core of people who need to make the revolution happen. Need to make this happen. And these people need to be, basically, they need to be sort of intellectuals, really. And they may not necessarily come from the working classes. He himself wasn't working class. I mean, he was, his family were a reasonably well-off landowning family within Russia. He also came up with, you know, certain explanations as to why he thought the Western Europe and America hadn't gone communist yet. It was to do with imperialism. But fundamentally, his contribution was the Communist Party of, in this case, Russia, had to be what he called the midwife of the revolution. We've got to make the revolution happen. Mm-hmm. Not only that, but the revolution needed to be cemented in place by revolutionary terror. In other words, by force. And some of the early acts of the Russian Communist Party were the development of an internal security apparatus called the Cheka. At that time, they later became ultimately the KGB and then today the FSB. But at that time, the Cheka, and part of their job was to suppress dissent, opposition, go to a town or a village or a district, and in Lenin's orders, just use as brutal a force as possible to just intimidate and terrify people into accepting communist rule and suppressing dissent. So he famously said, he's the person with the origin of the phrase, "The ends justifies the means." Mm-hmm. So if it's in the interests of the Communist Party and the Communist Revolution, then you can do anything you like. It doesn't matter who you kill, it doesn't matter how you kill them, it doesn't matter how brutal you are, how savage you are. So there was, beatings, arrests, arbitrary arrests, torture, firing squads, summary executions, murders, rapes, burning of crops, seizure of crops and of food in certain areas. Whatever you needed to do, if it's done for the purposes of the revolution, then it's a good thing. And if it's holding back the revolution, then it's a bad thing. Any other morality was bourgeois morality. It was the morality of the old working class. So being kind to people, being good in some way, any kind of Christian morality or any kind of traditional virtues, that's all swept aside. And the virtue is furthering the interests of the Communist Party. And that's effectively the one virtue. And you can do whatever you like to ensure that happens. So the revolution takes place in Russia. It is opposed by significant pushback from pro-Tsarist or just anti-communist forces. They fight a civil war from 1918, revolution's in 1917. They fight a civil war from 1918 to 1922. Ultimately, the communists prevail under the Red Army and its leader, who at that time was Leon Trotsky, another prominent figure. And the communist revolution is ultimately sort of secured in place by 1922.
And that was, I've read Sutton's work where he talks about how Wall Street and the American bankers and capitalists actually provided financial support for the revolution in Russia for the Bolsheviks.
I'm not hugely familiar with Sutton's work, but I mean, I've also heard that. I've also read bits and pieces around Sutton, what Sutton says. It's not, Anthony Sutton isn't part of the curriculum in any of the universities that teach Marxist philosophy. So, but yeah, I mean, that's certainly what Sutton says. They had to have had some kind of funding from somewhere, because it was an economically bankrupt idea. I mean, Russia went from being a net exporter of grain under the Tsars before Lenin to being a net importer of grain. I mean, they weren't really, after the collectivization of agriculture, they weren't really able to produce the wherewithal in a command economy that they needed. And certainly Lenin's very, very harsh, very austere, very severe policy of war communism led to pretty quickly to starvation. I don't have figures on how far that starvation went, but certainly there was, serious starvation in Russia in that time. And even Lenin himself had to then row back from war communism and implement what he called the new economic policy, which is basically, let's go back to capitalism. Let's go back to, or to some extent, go back to capitalism without the Communist Party losing control. So they kind of had a partial return to markets, and that sort of saved the situation sort of later in the 1920s.
Well, that's one of the interesting things about the whole Marxist concept and socialism, is that, when people have tried to apply it like they did in Russia, then they quickly find out that it doesn't work.
Absolutely. I mean, any truly serious kind of command economy has hit the buffers pretty darn quickly. And I think there are lots of reasons for that. I mean, one of the critiques of command economies, as opposed to market-based economies, is that in a market-based economy, you have an allocation of resources and a direction to what to produce and how much to produce, given to you by the price mechanism. So if the price of something is going up, that's an indication to producers, well, that's the thing that I need to be making then, because I need to get into that market and make some stuff. If the price is going down, that's an indication, well, maybe I need to put those productive resources over to something else. So the price mechanism kind of has this coordinating function in terms of the allocation of resources and the allocation of how and where you should use your the economy should use its productive capacity. If you lose the market and you lose the price mechanism, you don't know what to produce and you don't know how much to produce, or to what quality, or to what to what quality. So
that kind of led to the bread market. I mean, the bread lines and the food lines in Russia, right? I mean, my wife is from Russia, and she was born in 1984, so she was kind of in the end stage there. But she would say, yeah, you'd have kind of this glut of one item, and kind of other things. No, it's not possible. Like jeans, no, nobody's going to get any jeans. But then, we got lots of vodka this week, so enjoy vodka.
So you just stock up on whatever happens to be in the store at the time, right?
Yep, basically, yeah. So this is where you get the sort of, as Naira is rightly saying, huge gluts of certain things, but terrible shortages of other things. And if the terrible shortages is bread and food, that's a pretty serious darn problem. There's an example of when the Baltic states were part of the Soviet Union, in order to deal out employment fairly, so they thought, they had a shoemaking factory, but they had two factories because they wanted to give some employment to people in, I think it was either Latvia or Lithuania, and some employment to the same organization, effectively, some employment to someone else in Russia. And the Lithuanian factory, or the Baltic factory, made the right-hand shoe, and the other factory made the left-hand shoe. So you can imagine the kind of, basically it was economic chaos, really. You've always got this business of economic chaos in a planned economy, because you can't really, a nation of whatever Russia is now, 130 million people, I don't know what it was back in the day, but a nation of any kind of size, you can't possibly know what everybody's needs are right down to the last detail, and have a bureaucracy that knows all of that and all of that detail, all of that stuff, and then can get to sort out getting that made with all of the stages and all the different kind of pairs of hands and different elements of the productive process that it has to go through in order to get that thing to that person who needs it. One of the things about the market is that everyday stuff that that we use, you think of a car tire, that's come from rubber somewhere on the other side of the world. It's then gone through refining processes. It's been collected, refined, worked into something else. It's then it's gone somewhere else. It's been had the actual manufacturing process. Then it's gone somewhere else. It's been stored. Then it's been marketed. It's gone through umpteen hundreds and hundreds of pairs of hands. None of these people really, very few of these people know each other, and yet it's able to coordinate all of that right up to the point where it gives you a tire that you can put on your car. And you think of all of the millions of products that we have some involvement with, whether directly or indirectly or peripherally, and the extraordinary amount of coordination that the market is able to provide, but a command economy we just couldn't possibly do. So, a couple of reasons why there's just economic chaos in a planned economy. And I haven't even got into the business of incentive. Why would you work? Why would you produce this new product? Why would you do this? Why would you change the product that you're making, because there's what's in it for you. One of the famous sayings of I think it was factory workers in Hungary in the post-war period, talking about the conditions of their work, which was, we pretend to work and they pretend to pay us.
I like that.
So
they pay you this money, but there's nothing in the stores you can spend it on.
there's nothing you can spend it on, and the money may well be worthless by the time you get to the store anyway. Yeah, so it's really, socialism has been the catastrophic impoverishment of millions and millions of people everywhere it's been tried. If you look at China, the attempt to have what they call the Great Leap Forward, to go from an agrarian rural society almost overnight into a modern industrial society, and everybody being ordered to kind of make steel, because that was the thing. Because Mao said, industrial economies, they make steel. Well, let's all make steel then. And Chinese people went all around collecting up bits and pieces of metal to sort of put them into little back garden kind of furnaces to smelt it down, smelting furnaces that homemade. And so when they were doing that, they weren't then tending to the crops, and it's estimated that possibly as many as 65 million Chinese citizens starved to death because of that just colossal, utter discoordination of the productive effort. Because one man who was in charge of the whole thing said, "Well, we need to go and do this," but Mao didn't care. That was all acceptable. It was an acceptable cost as far as he was concerned. So another criticism really of Marxism, there is completely absent any sense of the value of human life. It doesn't matter who dies, how many die, how they die. This is all in a greater cause. So consequently, you've had that in China, you had starvation in North Vietnam, you've had it in North Korea, you had it in the Soviet Union. The Ethiopian famine of the 1980s, the famous famine there, was in part at least caused by the Marxist regime of Mariam Mengistu. I think that was his name, or Mengistu Mariam, I can't quite remember, who used the opportunity of an emerging starvation, and then later there was a drought, to just deal with his enemies in a certain province of the country. Stalin in the 1930s in the Soviet Union wanted to collectivize agriculture. He knew that the certain group of slightly wealthier peasants in places like Ukraine and other areas were probably going to oppose him because it wasn't in their interests to have their extra little bit of wealth taken away. They might have an extra cow or two, they might have a little bit of a small holding. So he just decided to, as the phrase went, liquidate the kulaks. That's what they were called, the kulaks. And there's somewhere between 4 and 7 million people in eastern Ukraine primarily were just systematically starved to death. The Soviet secret police, NKVD as they were then called, just shut off the whole area, seized their crops, mercilessly punished anybody who tried to get any kind of food. When they realized people were going back and eating the seed corn for the next year's harvest, they went back and seized that again. And it was just wipe them out as a class, because they're getting in the way of history. They're getting in the way of the final result of society, which is going to be the communist state of society. So it's hard to think of a philosophy or a movement with a bigger rap sheet than Marxism, Leninism, really.
Yeah. So, given that it hasn't worked anywhere, why does it still have appeal? Why are people still a good idea, you know.
It's a great question. I mean, there's the issue of the appeal of it, which I suppose give you my own views on that. And then there's the issue of why is it kind of being revisited under another guise, which we're seeing, I submit, today. Why did it have appeal? I think there's something in people which it makes the business of there being somebody to blame very, very attractive. You know, because life hurts. Life hurts sometimes, and if you're grindingly poor somewhere, if you are, you know, maybe you're working somewhere even and you just don't like the people you're working for, who hasn't had that experience, you know, life kind of sucks, then somebody comes along and says, you know what, it's their fault, those people over there, you know, and we're going to give you the means to take it out on those people. Yeah, we're going to give you the means to seize what they have, their property, their wealth, divide it up amongst yourselves, and you know, you'll be getting rid of them. So I think it taps into, I would say, taps into sort of levels of dissatisfaction and you know, and anger, a sort of underlying kind of grating kind of anger that is very common with people, because life is difficult and life hurts, and it hooks into that, I think, and it's able to sort of able to exploit that really well. It's what else is there about it, really? I think that's,
you know, I mean, it kind of taps into human jealousy, their desire to have something. You know, it's always strange to me when I hear people kind of talk disparagingly about the billionaires and all of this, because it seems like when I look at Elon Musk, for instance, and I see him, you know, he's running like 8 companies, and one of them is building rockets to go to Mars, and another one's boring holes under the earth and building electric cars. And, you know, it's, I mean, when I look at the level of change that he's providing to the world, like he's providing all of this effort to the world through his vision, and then, you know, that going down through his leadership structure through the companies. I mean, I think, and then I look at myself and I'm like, wow, I really, you know, I'm doing my little part in society or whatever, and my contributions and whatever that is, but I'm completely happy with him, you know, having billions of dollars, because he's making this monumental change for the planet through his vision.
Yeah. I mean, there's kind of a nice little sort of conceit within anything that's around this sense of jealousy, the sense of scapegoating, really, what it is, which is that, well, those people over there, they don't do anything. You know, the ruling class, they don't do anything. The capitalists don't do anything. You know, they're just sitting around, just reaping the profits. They're just they're exploiting you. You know, they're exploiting you. You know, no conception that actually what the capitalist has done is risked vast amounts of their own personal wealth to make a business, make an activity come into being, which has provided employment for people, which means that they can then put food on the table for their family. There's a huge amount of risk, an immense amount of work, immense amount of organizational skill. They've got to be, you know, have a tremendous amount of vision and drive and all these kinds of things. And then there's a wider benefit that ripples out through the rest of the society. You know, we're all you know, starting to be touched by things like electric cars, and, you know, Musk has very much pioneered that kind of thing. So it gives no credence or no sort of credibility to the business of what the entrepreneur actually does and what they provide. And if you go down the road of Marxism and you drive your entrepreneurs out of your society, well, who's going to do that then? Who's going to provide the capital? Who's going to have the vision of the new thing that society may that would benefit society? Well, you just got rid of all those people. So you're going to kind of be in trouble.
And
So,
what you had in the Soviet Union is that the only stuff they came up with was copying what was done in the West.
Yeah, copying what was done in the West, a lot of theft of technology, a lot of theft of what the West was making because they couldn't originate it themselves. One of the other things, I think, one of the other attractions, just going back to that question, is there's a kind of an emotional comfort if you can feel that, well, the government's going to look after me. I won't have to do anything. I won't have to experience this sense of life being difficult and this sense of life being hard, because the government will do it all for me and will provide for me. Like the government is kind of like God, really. It's like a kind of false religion, like a kind of a new religion that's going to subvert actual religion. But of course, to do that, for the government to provide everything, then the government's got to know everything about you. The government's also going to take everything that you've got and seize that and place it into their hands. So the government's going to have to be, again, kind of like God, really. It's going to have to be omnipotent to make everything happen in society. It's got to have all of that power over all of those people. It's got to have all the wealth and all the resources. It's got to know everything that's going on. It's got to be omnipotent, omniscient, and omnipresent. So it's almost like wanting that emotional comfort of there being a kind of secular God in the form of the government, and the sort of fiction and the kind of the sort of pseudo reality and the pseudo economics that socialism entertains, and actually became kind of prominent in the West after the Second World War, which seems to be founded on the idea that the state will just provide everything. The government, it's got some sort of magical power, just to magic up wealth out of nothing. Print more money, or I don't know, do this thing here, turn a dial here, pull a lever over there, as if the economy is a giant machine. Flick some switches over here, and the economy would sort of rumble into life and just provide everything. Like a goose just endlessly laying a series of golden eggs. And the unfortunate reality is that it doesn't, because you end up in vast amounts of debt. You end up destroying the value of your currency. You end up doing all these kinds of things. And so ultimately, if you keep going down that road, it will collapse. Whether it's the quick collapse of somewhere like Venezuela, or they're still holding on to power there, or whether it's the slow burning kind of collapse of these kind of Western economies that still have this idea that, well, we the government will provide everything for you, we'll do it all for you. No, you can't, because in the end, you can't magic up wealth out of nothing. So.
And so what about this theory of democratic socialism that's now kind of popular? How much are there actual real ties back to Marx and his philosophy, his original philosophy? Or
I suppose there's a kind of spectrum of thinking about socialism. There's social democracy, then there's democratic socialism, then there's socialism. There's different varieties of socialism. There's Fabian socialism. There's Marxist socialism. It's basically the same thing, except Fabian in socialism says we're going to arrive at socialism gradually, rather than in one sudden violent revolution. There's all kinds of things like that. But if you're in your society, all of the significant power and wealth is concentrated in the hands of the state, that would be a socialist society. But in order to have a democracy, you have to accept the fact that people have some power. They have some power. They have some, able to form their own ideas. They have to express an opinion and to do so freely. So that doesn't really seem to sit that well with a society where everything is in the hands of the state. Yeah. If all power and wealth is in the hands of the state, well, then what power does the citizen have? So as Milton Friedman, the free market economist, said, democratic socialism is a contradiction in terms. You can't have a democracy and have an absolutely statist society. So it's a fiction. Is my final answer really on that one. There is no such thing as democratic socialism. Not only are you taking all the economic power and joining it to the political power, you're putting all of that economic and political, and by the way, judicial power and law and order power and military power into the hands of the state, which is really going to be under the control of a really rather small clique of people. And by the way, that small clique of people are a clique of people who have got a pretty big axe to grind with certain sectors of society. So what do you think they're going to do with that power? How do you think they're going to use that power? Probably not well, not nicely, Yeah. Just having that power in your hands is enough to be able to control society. There was a Czech dissident writing in the 1980s when Czechoslovakia was a communist society who said, a lot of people in the West think that if I walk down my street, stand on a soapbox and start criticizing communism and talking about the virtues of capitalism, that there'll be a sort of police car that will, come to a screeching halt next to me and I'll be bundled away and go off into a gulag somewhere. He said, certainly in the sort of the later periods of the communist societies in Eastern Europe and Soviet Union, he said, no, it doesn't work like that. He said, probably nothing would happen to begin with. After about 2 or 3 months, I'd probably find I got demoted at work, or I lost my job, or I lost my government supplied apartment. My child didn't get into university. Something else happened here, something else happened there. So if you concentrate all economic power into the hands of the political power, then that's what they can do. If your ability to eat, have a roof over your head, and have the wherewithal just to live is in the hands of the government, and you want to say something that criticizes the government or doesn't accept the government's line, well, that's going to be a problem. So again, democratic socialism, there is no such thing.
There can be no free speech, which is required for democracy. The ability to freely give your vote, your opinion, is taken away.
If you're not allowed to privately own wealth or property, then democracy is a non-starter from the beginning. Yeah, because as I say, if you want to eat, and being able to eat depends on the government, you're going to have to toe the government line. Is the bottom line of things.
And so you were talking earlier about Marx's philosophy being scientific, that he kind of felt that he was in this great lineage of scientific knowledge. Did he present evidence normally you can reproduce studies and come to the same conclusions that another scientist has come to. So did he actually provide evidence for that?
No, not really. I mean, he didn't have what we would call data or genuinely empirical evidence. He made a claim, and he sort of referenced back to history and said, well, look at this period of history. This is what's happening here. This is what's happening in the next period of history. This is what's happening in the next period of history. And there was maybe a little bit of kind of credence given to his thinking with, he talked about capitalism would go through periods of boom and bust, what we would call boom and bust. He said capitalism will, have this sort of flourishing period and then it would collapse. There'll be economic crises. Capitalism would lurch from economic crisis to economic crisis. Eventually, it would just ultimately collapse and fail. And if you look at that on the surface, you can say, well, yeah, we have been through some collapses. There were banking crises at the end of the 19th century. There was the Wall Street crash in 1929, the depression of the 30s, 2008 we had the credit crunch, and there were some people certainly in this country who were saying he was the deputy leader of the Labour Party for a while, not anymore, John McDonnell, who was recorded after the 2008 collapse saying that he thought it was brilliant and he'd been waiting for this to happen for 30 years. what he's really saying is, I've been waiting for the collapse of capitalism because this proves our point. You know, that capitalism will just go through a series of you know, unending crises like this. So you can kind of see something along those lines. But I think ultimately its appeal is emotional more than anything else. It's getting into the sense of grievance. It's getting into the sense of envy, the sense of jealousy, the sense of dissatisfaction with life. And, you know, my life's kind of sucks and somebody, you know, whose fault is it? And somebody must be to blame. You know, it taps into those real, quite sort of deep levels, atavistic levels of the human psyche, but it does so extremely well. And it's an extremely attractive idea for a lot of people.
The value of a scientific theory, in a sense, is what, you know, how well does it allow you to predict what will happen, you know? And
yeah,
and the problem with Marxism is that it's been really terrible at predicting what would happen.
yeah,
So, kind of shoots
yeah.
the scientific theory, and it's an emotional appeal, you know, rather than science.
Well, this was the problem, and this is where we start to step off from classical, original Marxist or Marxist-Leninist theory into what can be called, or what ultimately becomes, neo-Marxism, which leads us up to the position of today. 1922, there's a sort of little convocation of, or big convocation actually, of Marxist theorists and intellectuals in Russia, in Moscow. Lenin is there, and they're looking at the problem of, wait, Marx said that if you went capitalist first, you'll go socialist first. But actually, Russia's had the socialist revolution, the communist revolution. That wasn't really much of an industrial capitalist society. The Western European nations haven't any kind of revolutions, and there were some, you know, attempted revolutionary activities and some, you know, street fighting in places like Germany and other Western European countries, but none of it came to anything or came anywhere near an actual communist revolution. So why was this? You know, they had to explain this problem of, well, was Marx completely wrong? You know, was the whole thing, reality of course is that Marx was completely wrong. The whole thing is just a kind of pseudo reality and just complete poppycock. You know, he's no account of what human beings really are, of how society is really organized, of how resources are really distributed. But rather than have to come clean and say, well, actually the theory is wrong, of course they're not going to do that. So they had to go away and kind of think up some alternate ideas. And this is where you get the rise of certain other Marxist intellectuals. The two big names are Georg Lukács in Hungary, and of course Antonio Gramsci in Italy. Lukács he gets involved in the very short-lived government in Hungary, which tries a program of, quote, cultural terrorism, unquote, including introducing sex education into schools and some other measures. And he thought that he could sort of weaken the bonds, essentially, of Hungarian society and culture and values. They were swept from power. He then becomes part of the formation of an academic institution in Germany which is dedicated to, amongst other things, the idea of, you know, basically taking Marxism forward and trying to re-explain things in terms of Marxism. And that becomes known as the Institute for Social Research, otherwise known as the Frankfurt Schools. It was in Frankfurt. So that's going on the one hand. And on the other hand, Antonio Gramsci, who's a senior member of the Italian, senior Italian socialist, is thrown into prison in 1926 by Mussolini. And really it's the work of Gramsci that is the real template and the real significant piece of work that, when you understand what he's saying, allows you to understand where we are now, allows you to understand why there are groups like BLM, Antifa, you know, sort of cancel culture, you know, political correctness, why all of that is going on now in the society that we've got here, the US and the UK and the other usually Western societies. Not only what that is, and how it came about and why it came about, but also where it's going. Okay, because it is in reality the attempt to bring about the Marxist socialist state by other means.
Mm-hmm. Why don't we end this show, wrap up, and that's kind of like that'll be a lead into the next show. We talk about Gramsci and what's happening in the world today, and it looks like it's going to be a very interesting topic. So we'll look forward to that. So thank you, Ed, and we'll see you all next time on our next episode of SummitCast.